My name is Ramsi Woodcock. I'm assistant professor at the University of Kentucky Rosenberg College of Law. I'm delighted that Spencer Waller has given me this opportunity to comment on Competition Overdose, Maurice Stucke and Ariel Ezrachi's most recent joint project. I was to deliver these marks originally at the 20th Annual Loyola Antitrust Colloquium, but of course the virus has gotten in the way. Competition overdose is a critique of four main types of competition. The first is what Maurice and Ariel call competition that benefits no one. One example they give is of a hockey player who takes his helmet off. That marginally improves his play, forcing other players to take their helmets off in order to compete, and the result is that the entire game is exposed to unacceptably high levels of risk. Nobody benefits, argue Maurice and Ariel. The second type of competition that they criticize is ruinous competition. That's when firms compete so heavily on observables like price that they're forced to cut corners on unobservables like product quality, harming consumers. The third type of competition that Maurice and Ariel critique is really the use of competition rhetoric to justify deregulation and privatization. Privatizers often argue that government services can be provided at better quality by the private sector because private sector firms are subject to competition. Maurice and Ariel point out that if the competition is ruinous, however, product quality can suffer. Finally, Maurice and Ariel critique the kind of competition that's been created by tech platforms. They give the example of Facebook, which encourages competition between app developers. But one of the metrics that they use is the provision of private consumer data to Facebook. The result is that these app developers can compete with each other in order to reduce the privacy of their customers, harming their customers as well. I'm not convinced, however, that any of these four situations that Maurice and Ariel talk about really represent failures of competition. The way to think about the relationship between competition and market outcomes, in my opinion, is to think of the metaphor of making a clay statuette using a mold. The artist has to form the mold correctly. If they want to create a statuette of an eagle, for example, the mold shouldn't look like a bunny rabbit. But in order to make that statuette, the artist also has to take the clay and force it into the mold, and force it in hard enough to make sure that there are no air pockets and that the clay fully takes on the form of the mold. Only in this way do you end up creating a statuette that actually looks like what you're trying to make. In this metaphor, the mold is consumer purchase decisions. Consumer purchase decisions discipline the kind of products that are offered and produced on the market. The clay, those are firms, or the products that firms create. Firms create those products based on consumer preferences and consumer purchase decisions. If consumers are buying a particular product, firms will create more of that type of product. And if consumers are not buying another type of product, firms will create fewer of that type of product. So the kinds of products created by the market are formed by consumer purchase decisions. Well, what's competition in this metaphor? Competition is the act of forcing the clay into the mold. The harder the firms compete, the more likely they are to produce products that accord with the purchase decisions and the preferences of consumers underlying those decisions. The less competition there is in the market, the less need firms have to produce products that are as delightful as possible to consumers. In each of the four cases that Maurice and Ariel point to, the problem is not competition, it's that the mold isn't formed correctly. The mold looks like a bunny rabbit, where in fact what society wants is the eagle. Consider the hockey player example. The problem here isn't that hockey players are competing too hard. The problem is that consumers, the fans, they're willing to pay to see hockey players play without helmets. They like the better play that results, or they like the blood. They like the gladiatorial combat that seems to result. In the case of ruinous competition, it's even clearer. In ruinous competition, the problem is that consumers have cognitive limitations. They're willing to pay for products that have low quality because they can't perceive that the products have low quality. The problem isn't that firms are competing too hard. The problem is that consumers aren't buying the products that are best for them. The problem, again, is the mold, not the act of forcing the clay into the mold. Because after all, you can't create a statuette at all if you don't force the clay into the mold. Whatever mold you have, whether it's good or bad, won't produce what you want if you're not forcing the clay all the way into it. By the same token, in the case of privatization, the problem is that government often doesn't impose purchase decisions on privatized firms that require them to produce the government service at the highest possible level of quality. Consider the example of private prisons that Maurice and Ariel write about at length in the book. They point out that these prisons often hold inmates for longer than they should because the prisons are paid by the duration of the inmate's stay. The problem here is obviously that government shouldn't be paying private prisons based on the duration of inmate stays. That creates a bad incentive. The mold is the problem here. The problem isn't that private prisons may be competing too hard in order to provide services to the government. And finally, the case of tech platform competition. Is the problem with Facebook that app developers are competing too hard to provide what Facebook wants? No, the problem is that what Facebook wants is bad for society. Facebook wants the data to be extracted from consumers, so it creates a competitive market that rewards that. The obvious solution seems to be government regulation that prevents Facebook from rewarding that kind of competitive behavior. The problem here, I think, is that Maurice and Ariel are really talking about something that's completely outside of the market context. They're not interested in making statuettes by forcing clay into molds at all. But they start in their mind's eye with examples in which what they really want can't actually be carried out in a competitive environment. And as a result, they consider mistakenly that competition is their enemy, but it's not. The key thing that Maurice and Ariel want for the way society produces socially optimal goods is for firms to behave morally. They want to bring morality back into markets. And I say bring back because once upon a time, morality was everywhere in markets. In the 19th century, courts enforced the doctrine of consideration. They checked the fairness of prices. Maurice and Ariel want morality back into markets. They want firms to take on the responsibility of producing socially optimal products regardless of the signals that the purchase decisions of consumers are sending to them. But they come to this realization, they come to this epiphany by thinking about the moral firm that's caught up in a competitive environment in which their morality is not rewarded. That's the hockey player example. The hockey player who says, you know what, it's bad for players to play without helmets and keeps their helmet on, loses. They don't play as well. Fans don't like them as much. As a result, they're punished for being moral. So here, competition stands in the way of morality. But Maurice and Ariel's point about the importance of remoralizing markets extends far beyond the narrow situations in which competition might prevent firms from behaving morally. Indeed, in our increasingly concentrated economy, the problem really isn't excessive competition. The problem is much more likely to be that we have oligopoly firms or monopolies which simply choose not to behave morally, even though they could if they wanted to do so. In the context of this metaphor, what Maurice and Ariel are arguing is that we shouldn't keep making statuettes by forcing clay into molds at all anymore. Instead, the clay should form itself. The clay should form itself into the eagle. Obviously, that doesn't work very well in the context of the metaphor because clay is not an animate object, much less a thinking one, but firms are. Firms are run by human beings, and human beings think. They're capable of moral behavior. And Maurice and Ariel are saying, we can speak to the clay, and the clay could listen. The trouble here is that Maurice and Ariel don't realize that this is what they're arguing until the end of the book. And they themselves say this, that they didn't come to the realization that the core of their argument was morality until they got to the chapter regarding tech platform competition. As a result, reading through this book can be frustrating because one encounters argument after argument criticizing competition in a market context in which competition is really not to blame. It's only at the end that one realizes the much more ambitious, broader goals that Maurice and Ariel have. If Maurice and Ariel had built this book from the ground up on the thesis of remoralizing markets, I think they would have had time to address some concerns that any reader is going to have with this project. One is that morality has not always been on the side of progressives. Maurice and Ariel can hope, of course, that firms will adopt the kind of progressive morality that they espouse, but there's no reason why they necessarily would. And in fact, even today we encounter firms that refuse to sell to certain customers, for example, based on religious moral grounds that are hardly progressive. Overall, this is a delightful book to read. You have two of the top progressive antitrust scholars in the world thinking seriously about the big questions of the day and trying to tie them to competition policy. And you have these two scholars showing the courage to get outside of their comfort zone and to talk about issues above and beyond just antitrust. I highly recommend this book.